Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this keynote session of this afternoon. I hope you are all hearing me well. If you hear me, can someone just say yes on the chat?
Yeah.
Oh, I even had a sound. That was great. Okay, so the theme is climate-friendly, sustainable food. And we will have two keynote lectures. First one will be Wouter Poortinga, who is Professor of Environmental Psychology and an Associate Director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations at the Cardiff University in UK. His title will be Public Attitudes to Meat Reduction as Climate Action. And the second talker of this session is Sarah Hornborg. She's a researcher at the Sustainable Consumption and Production Unit at the Rice Research Institutes of Sweden. And her title is Blue Growth, a Systems Analysis Perspective. After these two have both delivered their 20-minute keynote lecture, we will open breakout rooms. I will randomly assign you in breakout rooms, and we hope you can discuss what you heard, what was unclear, what are the questions that you would like to ask these two experts that we have here today. And then when you come back to the session, please use the chat for posting your questions, and we hope we get a nice discussion going between Wouter and Sarah and myself, and also, of course, then the input from you. But now, without further notice, I think I should also say that this is streamed to YouTube and is being recorded. So now, Wouter, maybe you would like to put on your video and share your presentation.
I'm trying to start my video, but it has been disabled. So if the host could change that, then I will turn on my video as well.
Yes, I'm hoping our technical team can do some magic here.
Let's see. And I believe my camera is now on as well, and I assume you can also see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, so well, thanks very much, Katja, and also thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about my research here today. So what I'd like to do in this presentation is to talk to you about public attitudes to meat reduction as climate action, and it is partly based on research we're doing as part of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. But I also will draw from some other research that has been conducted in the area, just to give you an idea what people think and feel about changing their diets for environmental reasons, but also to see whether it's possible to change their diets. Now, before I start with the presentation proper, I'd first like to say a little bit about our center, so the CAST Center, which stands for Center for Climate Change and Social Transformations. And what we're trying to achieve with the center is to study the social transformations that are needed to achieve a low-carbon, sustainable society. And in particular, what we're trying to do is to see how, as a society, we can live differently and better to achieve rapid greenhouse gas emission reductions. Now, as part of that, we're looking at 4 challenging areas, as we call them, and that is about what we eat, how we heat our homes, the way we travel, but also what we buy. And then we're looking at the roles of values, co-benefits, and then rates of change therein. Now, the reason why we're looking at these 4 areas is because without addressing these aspects, it will not be possible to achieve any net zero targets that we may have. So it's not only about, generating energy, for example, with wind farms or solar farms, but it's also about, the way we, use energy and carbon are responsible for carbon emissions. Now, the one area I would like to focus on is diet, and then in particular, meat as a potential action we can take on climate change. Now, the production of livestock has, both for meat and for dairy consumption, has significant environmental impacts in general, but it's also a major contributor to climate change. Now, there's different estimates how much that is, but according to the FAO, it's about 1/8 of all greenhouse gas emissions that we're emitting, globally. And there's different factors in that. So there's the emissions from animals and livestock, which is mainly methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas. But it's also about the rearing and the feeding of livestock, and that requires substantial amounts of water and land. Yeah, so that may lead to land use changes, and land use changes are a large factor within climate change. Now, the problem here is that, let's say, protein production, animal protein production is very inefficient. And that's a very high feed to food ratio. So you need almost 10 times as much plant-based protein to produce 1 kilogram of animal protein, and which is of course dependent on the type of meat. But there's also about the heating and cooling of farm buildings. It's about processing and transportation of animal products. But in general, it's mainly about land use changes. It's about the production of grain and soy for feed, and it's also about methane as part of manure management. Now, as the world develops, the demand for meat and dairy is going up. Yeah, so we're already producing an enormous amount of meat for consumption, but it's expected to grow substantially over the next 20 to 30 years. Now, it's important to note that the amount of greenhouse gas emissions varies according to the type of livestock being produced. And around 65% of all greenhouse gas emissions is attributable to cattle raising. Now, this is mainly to do with the size of cattle production, because it's by far the biggest part of livestock production, but also on a protein per kilogram protein level, it's much higher for cattle, but also for sheep and goats, for example, than for, let's say, for white meats. But then also for white meats, the number of carbon emissions is much, much higher than for plant-based protein. So it's both the size and the intensity of carbon emissions per kilogram of produced food. Now, plant-based diets, according to the IPCC, are a major opportunity for mitigating and adapting to climate change. And if large number of people would change their diet, that could free up millions of square kilometers of land. Yeah, that's both for the rearing and the feeding of the animals. And that can lead then to a global CO2 reduction by up to 8 billion tons per annum. And that is absolutely massive. Yeah, it's a really large part. So it's partly because of the rearing, it's partly because of methane, but most importantly, it's also because of land use changes or the land use for the feeding and rearing of cattle. Now, also, if you change your diet, it has significant other co-benefits, which is one of the aspects that we're interested in as part of the CAST Center. Yeah, so if you shift to a more plant-based diet, and that can be vegetarian, that can be vegan, but it can also be simply low meat. Yeah, not everybody has to go vegan, of course. But that's then associated with benefits in terms of, less cardiovascular disease, less obesity, and also fewer cancers like colon cancer. Now, this slide shows a number of high impact actions that people could take, let's say, as an individual or as households. Now, it controversially shows that having one fewer child is the most impactful thing you can do, especially if you're living in the developed world. Yeah. Now, while ignoring that option, right? You can see that mobility-based kind of actions have the highest impact. So if you would live car-free, for example, if you would avoid flying, or if you would go electric in terms of your car, these have the biggest carbon savings associated with them. But also moving to a plant-based diet is a high impact action, and also depending where you live can have a very high saving in terms of carbon emissions. Now, on the right-hand side, you can see that it differs according what type of diet it is. So vegan diet is, of course, the highest impact, but also a more sustainable diet or vegetarian diet is way up the list of most impactful actions you could take. And then in terms of the benefits, they are shown here. These are based on the avoided costs, so the social cost of carbon and the healthcare cost associated with the diseases associated with meat consumption. And as you can see, they're really large numbers. But it's not only about the avoided cost, it's also about the quality of life. Yeah? So you live longer and in better health, and that's reflected in the numbers on the right-hand side. Now, this is environmental economics. I'm not familiar with that, but just to show you the kind of benefits that are associated with these kind of actions. Now, for a long time, diet has been the forgotten sector for climate mitigation. Yeah, so dietary changes, they haven't been part of climate change mitigation strategies for a long, long time, although that seems to be changing in the last few years. So for example, the IPCC, they have drawn attention to the need to cut down on meat consumption as part of a report on land use changes, because that is one of the largest factors in terms of diet. And you can also see why that is. Why it's been forgotten. And environmental groups, they have been very reluctant to venture into this area because it has very low political appeal. A lot of people there are attached to eating meat, and for that reason, they're quite unpopular. But also for a long time, there has been a lack of media attention and also public awareness, although again, that is changing over the last few years. Now, many people do not see the link between the two, and therefore do not consider it as an environmental action. And for that reason, there's quite a bit of resistance to the idea. Although the question here, of course, is, have perception changed with increasing concern about climate change, but also with increasing attention to the role of meat and diet in climate change. Now, as part of research we've conducted at the CARS Center, we've looked at, let's say, the perceived necessity of lifestyle changes. This is more about the awareness of, let's say, having to take action in the different areas. So these are the challenging areas I was talking about before. And you can see that there's a high level of awareness that we need to do something about the amount of energy we use in terms of heating and cooling our buildings. Also, in terms of air travel, awareness is quite high that things need to change. That's 43% say that we should definitely do this. And the same with material consumption. Now, at the bottom, you can see that the numbers are much, much lower for meat consumption. Yeah, so there's 24% instead of 50%. Now, for two items, we asked the same question in 2019 and 2020. So that's why we can make direct comparisons. And you can see that the awareness of having to make changes in terms of flying has increased substantially. Yeah, in just 1 year. Yeah, so it's gone up from 28% to 43%, which I showed you before. There's also an increase for diet, for meat, but it's much, much smaller. And you could say that's within the margins of error. And what I take home from this is that, let's say, awareness that we need to do something about our mobility, about flying, seems to be getting through, but then more work needs to be done in terms of diet. Now, we also asked our participants what they thought were the most impactful actions they could take, and they could choose from 8 that were listed here. And you can see, as expected, that most people would go for minimizing air travel, reducing energy use at home, and changes in terms of car use. And these are the typical environmental measures that have been drummed into us that we should take. Yeah, so they're very high up in people's, awareness, of people's, thinking. But I would like to draw your attention to the bottom, Yeah, because it said that eating less red meat and reducing new purchases is only 18% and 23% respectively. And this is where you have indirect carbon emissions, so embedded carbon emissions, and they're far more difficult to understand. The impacts are similar. They're just as high as the other ones shown here, but they're chosen far less often. And also by Ipsos Mori, they looked at the actions proposed by Wines and Nichols. And you can see that if you ask people, well, what do you think is the most impactful? Many people will say recycling, because recycling is good for the environment. Climate is the environment, so therefore recycling needs to be good for the climate, for the climate change. But then eating a plant-based diet is way down the bottom again. Yeah, so people do not really make the link in terms of carbon emissions. Now, the good news is that quite a substantial number of people are willing to consider changes. You know, in principle, they're not against it. So that doesn't mean that they will make the changes, but about 2 out of 5 say that they're perhaps willing. Yeah, so a third say that they don't, and it's mainly men who are less willing to make those changes. There are different explanations for that, but you can see that there is some kind of a market that we could tap into. But then the question, of course, is how do you do that? How do you reduce meat consumption, between brackets for environmental purposes, because you could also do it for other purposes, of course, and then you would have co-benefits for the environment as well. Now here, it is important to make a distinction between downstream and upstream interventions. And when you have downstream interventions, it's about trying to influence people, their choices. Yeah, and that is usually done through information. And the hope is if you provide information about the impact, that people will change their behavior. Yeah, there's also other ways of doing it, but that is the typical downstream intervention. Now, upstream interventions, they're much more about changing the trade-offs of different choices and decisions. Yeah, so what you try to do is to influence the context so you can support action, so you enable the positive action that you would want to promote. You can do that through economic measures, educations where it is about changing cultural norms. So cultural norms, they also, let's say, the context, but you can also make it impossible to behave in a certain way, for example. But infrastructure is essential here. Yeah, so if you want to people choose the bicycle instead of the car, you have to make sure that it is safe to cycle. Otherwise, a lot of people will not change their behavior. Now, just a few examples here. So in terms of an informational intervention, so a typical downstream intervention was conducted by a PhD student of mine, so Emily Wolstenholme, and she was interested whether messages about the health and the environmental benefits of reducing meat could have an impact. She used a convenience sample of about 300 undergraduate students, and then these students, they were randomly assigned to different conditions. And then the students, they received messages every day, so just to remind them about why they would do it. And then they were asked to keep a food diary, and we asked about their meat consumption at baseline, at the end of the experiment, and then at a 1-month follow-up. Now you can see on the right-hand side is that there was quite a substantial impact. Yeah, so the meat consumption was almost halved within this particular sample. So you could see that, health, environmental messages, they all seem to be working. Now, something else was also going on, and that's why I didn't show you the control group. But, at the end of the experiment, we found that it had an effect. Yeah, that there was a reduced meat consumption as compared to the control group, as you would want to see. But then at time 3, also the control group had, caught up with the intervention group. Now, we don't really know what was going on, but we think it's some kind of a social spillover in the sense that it was the same cohort we were looking into. So we think there may have been some talk among the students, which may explain this effect. Now, an upstream intervention, so this is an example of a nudge intervention. Now, nudges are usually seen as a downstream intervention, but there it's more about changing the trade-off of the choice architecture. So in my view, it's more like an upstream intervention. And this is research conducted at Cambridge University, where they looked at purchases within their canteens. And you can see that the vegetarian options available, or the availability of vegetarian options, they are linked to increased vegetarian consumption. So if you make it a more common option, more people will simply choose it. And also, if you have a more experimental or systematic, let's say, intervention, you can see the same effects. Now, the effects are smaller than when you do it via an observational study, and that is usually the case. But also when you systematically change the number of vegetarian options, you can see that people are more likely to choose those options. So simply making options available can change their behavior. Now, what can we conclude from that? Now, a substantial minority are willing to consider changing their own lifestyles relating to diet, although that, of course, doesn't mean that they will actually do that. You know, more needs to be done, so it won't magically change, but it is possible to design interventions where people make changes to their diets. But very few see the necessity yet. Yeah, so many do not see it as an environmental action. They underestimate the role of greenhouse gas emissions from these kind of consumption categories. And I think that has to do with embedded emissions. Yeah, so for example, land use aspects, they may be very difficult to comprehend, you know, in terms of what it will do for climate change. And that's the complexity of the system, right? And I think we'll hear more about it later on by Sarah. There's also various other barriers, yeah, to those changes, and they can be, you know, lifestyle, they can be identity, they can be habits, they can be cultural norms. There's a lots of them, which I haven't mentioned here, but that's something that you have to consider as well. And the last thing that I'd like to say before stopping this presentation, interventions, they can also lead to reactants, as shown by a colleague of mine. So she tried to do a similar kind of experiment, and the organization, they organized a petition against vegetarian options. So if you do it too blatantly, if you do it without consulting, let's say, the people you're affecting, then that can lead to reactants and less change. So that is something to keep in mind as well. And that's it for me today. So Jolch and Vauer, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Wouter. That was really, really interesting. And I think this is very thought-provoking for everyone. Now, there's some technical things here, so I kind of can't. I'll just continue talking. They're telling me just ignore us. So now I see that some people already put things in the chat. That's great. Just put your thoughts when they come to your mind. You get a question, put it there, and then we will take them after both of the presentations and the breakout room session. But now I would like Sarah to start sharing her screen and her video so that we can hear her Blue Growth Systems Analysis perspective. Okay, now we don't hear you, Sarah. At least I don't.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Common problem. But you see my presentation now in presentation mode.
Yes, it looks great.
Perfect.
Please.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Katja, for inviting me to this course. And I will talk about blue growth and from a system analysis perspective that we work with. And just a brief mention first that I come from RISE, Research Institutes of Sweden. And we work with all kinds of different innovations and co-create sustainable solutions for sustainable growth of society. But also from seafood, we work a lot with the whole full value chain of seafood, both from product development to understanding environmental impacts and so on and so forth. So that's what we do at RISE as an example. But today, let's see here now. It doesn't want to change. Okay, so just some brief reflections on Wouter's talk here. He talked a lot about that the consumer recommendations are to decrease the meat consumption and that the greenhouse gas emissions of land-based meats are very high and also very complex. If you look at seafood then, the most consumers are recommended to actually increase their consumption of seafood, both from planet and health perspectives. And if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions, they are generally lower than land-based meat production, although highly variable. And if you look at capture fisheries, they are much less complex. I'll get back to that. So in these diet shift discussions, we always say going from red to green protein, where is the blue in these discussions? So today's talk, I will talk a bit about ghosts of past, present, and future seafood, following a Charles Dickens approach. I will summarize key findings of life cycle assessments of seafoods and related methods. And I will also bring some future perspectives related to blue growth and system analysis. And of course, in the future, everything will come from the oceans. It's seen as a facilitator of many challenges that we face. Food provisioning, clean energy, and there's a lot of discussions on carbon, and it holds so many promises. And it's not surprising because even though it's called planet Earth, it's actually should be called planet Ocean, because over 70% of the surface is actually water, and it only provides today depends on how you estimate, 4% of the global food production. But to progress the future that we want for seafood, the discussion is often what should we eat and how should it be produced, and to actually implement these, the desired direction that we want to take. And in this discussion, I would like to take a step back, because I just like that. Look at ghosts from the past, because the ocean has been important to humanity throughout history. We've been eating seafood resources for a very long time. And also from many centuries, we've had quite an extensive exploitation, like the major herring fisheries in Scandinavia already during Middle Ages, really providing a huge industry and with high nutritious value. And another example is the Northwest cod fishery, where actually they fished millions of tons for centuries for long, and also supported growth of Europe from that resource. But it's also then important to remember that if you look at capture fisheries, they are very sensitive ecosystems, because they actually produce food from a kind of a natural system that is affected over time, of course, but it's a natural system. And after centuries of substantial use, you can have a sudden intensification that could risk a full collapse. Again, the infamous Northwest Atlantic cod fishery. So in these blue growth agendas, it's very important to learn from the past, because blue growth is nothing novel. It has been, these ideas have been along for a long time. So remember where you heard it first, but I think we'll have to think about blue regrowth. It's really about where we want to head, and don't forget the lessons from the past. And there was a study looking at failures and success of past initiatives. And it's really about this human dimension of equity and access, and a management that is really responsive, holistic, and based on science and monitoring for success. So that's the key for the future, learn from the past. And there's a lot of examples of failures due to short-sightedness in how the things have been prioritized. So that's important to keep in mind. So at present then, the situation for seafoods, it may look like both a half full and half empty glass, depending on where and what you look at. And according to the latest FAO estimates, you would find that according to their definitions, most fisheries are fished within sustainable limits, almost 80% of volume. But it also shows a negative trend. So it's important to be aware of how we can reverse that and allow for more sustainable fisheries. In terms of aquaculture, it has made an immense growth, but the actual portion of the volume that is not dependent on feed, it's only 30% of volume, and that also shows a negative trend. So it's important to look at what kind of species you feed and what they will be fed with. And from the positive side, you would see an increasing trend, or stable, that most of the production, it's actually used for direct human consumption these days, nearly 90% of the total volume. So that's something positive. And if you look in particular for capture fisheries, it's also important to be aware of that from a global perspective, it's really an unequal share that is taken from a limited and highly nutritious resource. So it's important to take that into account as well. Yes, so they're challenging to work with. But if you look at seafood as a food commodity, we often say that if you may consider seafood as sustainable or not, it depends on what you compare with. Do you compare with meats or vegetables? How you compare, what kind of impacts are being compared and in what way, and what you compare, which kind of environmental impacts, and also which kind of products, because seafood is a very, very highly variable food production comprising of thousands of species that can be produced in many different ways. So what we do, we use life cycle assessment as a basis in our assessments, and it's also known for this cradle to grave perspective, and looks at pressures per unit of a product from an environmental perspective throughout the supply chain. And through these life cycle assessments, you can do things like define large and small in terms of contribution from different parts of the production. You can, by this, prioritize your actions to, if you quantify potential trade-offs, you can find the magnitudes and try to see if they can be mitigated in any way. And in doing that, you can also get an overview of the system effects of if you make a change to see the potential consequences in a broader perspective. And here I will show you an example of Norwegian Seafood, an assessment that colleagues of mine have been involved in. And it shows greenhouse gas emissions in live weight at landing or at the production site. So it's just the production phase, this. And this will show that if you look at small pelagics in fisheries, such as herring, you would see it's a very low, very low carbon footprint. If you look at crustaceans, you would find that they are most often higher than fish, and they also have a lower edible yield, would then affect the greenhouse gas emissions per edible, if you look at that. And if you look at a species as cod, the carbon footprint would vary a lot between different gears and stock status, but it would be somewhere there in between. If you look at salmon, Wouter already mentioned this. This part of the carbon footprint comes from deforestation, and there are many different ways of how to calculate this, and it's difficult, but it certainly can add to the footprint of products when you use here it's soy in salmon feed in Norway. And you would also see that feed is often important in these carbon footprints. If you then add the supply chain, you would see that the feed it dominates the total impact from production all the way to wholesaler if you have a farmed product. And if you look at a fish product, you will see that the fishing phase, that is the fuel used during the fishing, dominates. And these gray bars, they add the different supply chains and different transport modes. But the key issue here is not the distance that matters, it's the mode. If you add flight in the supply chain, you considerably drive the emissions. But most often, seafood would actually be transported by ship. So in general, you would say that the primary production, the fishing and farming, would dominate the total footprint. And you would also see, if you look at all the products that was involved in this study, you would see the huge variability here again, from 1.1 to 29 kilos of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilogram of product. And that really shows the range of seafood from, say, from carrots up to meats so they can really play any role, and also having a high nutritional content. So just to summarize, because these graphs really illustrate a general finding in LCAs, that if you look at capture fisheries, you would find that the fuel use during the fishing phase most often dominates the whole value chain, the whole product footprint, and is highly variable between different fisheries. And this is then influenced by first the target species. If you target a herring or a crustacean or a cod, they have different catchability in the water. And the gears used. It's really how efficient can you actually catch this species with the gear that you use. And also stock status. If there is more fish in the sea, the easier it is to actually catch it and more efficient. If you look at aquaculture, you would also find then that the feed inputs during the farming phase most often dominates again the total input. So that's what's important to keep in mind. And this is influenced, it doesn't matter so much the system, because the different systems rather add to the total footprint. It's rather the species farm in terms of the feed conversion ratio, where fish is generally more efficient than land-based animals, but still it can vary in how efficient they are. And it also depends on the feed composition. What are the different components in the feed formula, and how much is needed to grow 1 kilogram of a certain species? And this, especially for capture fisheries, it has some management implications, and I will get back to that later on. It's also important to think about what are fair comparisons. I already touched upon this. What is being compared? If you compare, so far I've showed you examples of comparing a kilogram, a weight of something, but you can also compare the protein content or the nutritional value instead, and that would also look different. And also how it is compared, what kind of data is used, and what kind of impacts and products are considered. And just to provide you an example here that some colleagues of mine have done, this looks at Swedish seafood consumption. And you see this graph with a lot of different fishes, like salmonids and lobsters and herrings represented in different colors. And the size is how much that is eaten in Sweden. And you would also find where the land-based animals are positioned in this graph. And if you look at this green square, they really represent a combination of a low greenhouse gas emission and a high nutritional value, whereas the red corner up here is a lower nutrition and a high climate impact. So there are better and worse choices. So a seafood is not a seafood. That's very important to be aware of. But I also want to just mention that LCA cannot encompass all different environmental aspects. So there's a lot of things to consider that are more system specific or product specific that relates to seafoods. And so there is even need for even broader decision support in order to truly identify sustainable solutions. And also including the human dimension, of course, but I won't touch upon this in this talk, just want to mention it in brief. And one example is another system analysis tool, ecological risk assessments, that really offers a complementary perspective to LCA because it really focuses on the local ecosystem risks rather than these global emissions, such as greenhouse gas emissions. And it's used in various ways for seafood, such as the eco-certification Marine Stewardship Council, MSC, and also to implement some ecosystem-based approaches in, for example, Norway and Australia. So we just started to look at how you can combine this to even have a more holistic decision support that is needed, combining risk assessment and life cycle assessment. So we looked at Australian toothfish fisheries in the Antarctic, for instance, because they had been subjected to ecological risk assessments a couple of times by Australian authorities. And if you put them, LCA and ecological risk assessment side by side, you can find that there were less risks to the local ecosystem because there had been data collected, but it also came with higher carbon footprint if you put that by the side, because there were a lot of societal values in terms of you need to protect seabirds and you need to you target certain sizes, and there will always be trade-offs in the different actions and what you do. So in this context, if you put them side by side, you might find this local ecosystem versus global emissions, but it then also adds to the complexity. So, but if it was easy, it would be easy to also to progress towards a direction that you want to head. But it's but I do find it's very important to really think about what kind of decisions or supports are available today in terms to really be able to avoid unintentional consequences that might be mitigated, or at least set limits for what are acceptable consequences for different actions that you make. So now what? So now what? Yes. Just to summarize now this complexity of that different system analysis can provide you with. This is an example again from Norwegian feeds, actually, Norwegian farming for salmon and the feed composition. And you can see from the 1990s up till recent years, it has gone from nearly fully marine to be dominated by land-based feed ingredients. And at the same time, you would find that the greenhouse gas emissions has increased. And that is dependent on a lot of factors, both how efficient the production systems has been in keeping low mortalities, but also when you start to look at feed in detail and look at such aspects such as microingredients can have a really high climate impact if you include them, and they're not always included. And you would also find that deforestation of soy is also becoming a problem for these assessments in terms of driving the footprint. So it's really important here to consider that blue growth, it's not something that can happen in isolation, because all these different sustainable development goals, they are linked, because this growth in aquaculture here is actually becoming increasingly dependent on land-based sources, and we know that land use is limited, and they also will come with trade-offs. So what we need is really to figure out what kind of decision support that we need, develop it, and utilize it, not at least. We need to find some kind of comparability across land and ocean, because the systems are getting increasingly connected with this different when aquaculture grows. And also to think about how we can enable nutrition sensitive policies, really to consider the high variability of nutrition between different seafoods, and how to promote and the high variability in carbon footprint, and really provide the best option, promote the best options, and try to improve or decrease the options that are less optimized. And also to not to forget to learn from the past, to avoid unintentional consequences of any changes that you do in the system to promote growth, and really consider these different human dimensions of institutional, social, and economic aspects of marine resource use. And the second part is really we really need to find what are the resilient food systems, and they really, a functional value chain starts with management, because you really need to have a sustainable produced resource or raw material to actually even to be able to choose as a consumer or industry. And in fisheries, it's really about promoting gears and set abundance targets that are able to minimize environmental pressures while maximizing societal value. And I'd argue that management agencies are not really there today, so there is work to be done. And this is of increasing emergency in order to safeguard food security. I was involved in a study that looked at food production shocks globally, and shocks are defined as sudden production losses, and they are increasing globally. And aquaculture production is extra sensitive due to disease outbreaks, and capture fisheries are mainly subjected to mismanagement, as you see. So it's really important to safeguard that we actually have sustainable raw material to work with. And of course, minimize food losses. The more we can produce, the less inputs has been required for the same output. And finally, it's about both improving production and diversifying consumption. If you look at Sweden today, this is what we eat: farmed salmon and some white fish, in particular cod and shrimp. And they offer, all of them offers improvement potentials, but are very narrow in terms of compared to what's actually being produced and could be produced. And the discussion is often that we need to eat other species that have less impacts or at least different impacts, because no food comes with no impact. But I'd argue that it's about both improving in the current systems and looking at other seafood products. So because the consumer demand will always be out there, so it's important to work with those producers and consumers in this sense. And with that, I thank you for listening.
Thank you. This was also extremely interesting, and I think these two different talks very nicely complemented each other and bring kind of the land and meat, and then on the other side the ocean part. Okay, now I will open the breakout rooms. Let's see, it's 1:15 now, so we will start the discussion here in the plenary at 2:30 again, so in about 15 minutes. Yeah, write down your questions so you can put it in the chat afterwards when you come back. See you soon again. Bye. I hope you all had nice and interesting and maybe a bit heated discussions in the breakout rooms. So now I would like to, can our technical support pin somehow us three, or is that possible in this this version? So I would at least now ask those that have something to ask, write in the chat, right? Just write, for example, Sarah, and then to Wouter, and then ask your questions in the chat, so we can start getting the discussion going. I see at least Sarah is there. Okay. Okay, first one is coming to Sarah. What do you suggest could be some method for introducing comparability across land and ocean? And which reference points or parameters would be most feasible?
I love that question. I spend a lot of thought on it, and it's not an easy answer. I can't provide any solutions on that one, but I do think that it's something that should be really thought more about. There have been attempts and discussions on using things like the IUCN red list indices, because they are applied in the consistent way between land and ocean and things like that. But there are some things cannot really be quantified. So I think that risk-based approaches is a way to go, where you can have like probabilities and scale and those kind of factors into that. But it's I don't have any suggestions at this point. I just know that we need to start to develop more of them.
Yeah, and it's obviously like we have some things that we can compare, like climate gas emissions.
Yes.
They are comparable, but then there is the whole suite of other things, like agriculture. You usually reduce the biodiversity to one species, the one you
Definitely.
are. But then in the sea, the situation is very different. You very rarely just remove all the species for a certain area. So how to account for those things? It's definitely a very good question.
It's a very good question, because life cycle assessment often get criticized. Oh, well, the climate footprint, you know, but there are all the other things. Just it's a natural production from capture fisheries, so it can't increase. So it's not an option. But how to account for that? It's not easy.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Then there is a question. Well, maybe I take this one because this is directly to Sarah again. How about seaweed? How is that in efficiency, sustainability, and so forth? And I think here Martina is thinking about as food item, I assume.
Personally, I have not done any research on seafood, but I have colleagues that are looking into that actually this year. And from what I know, I think that they're quite low in carbon footprint most often, because they don't require feed if you farm them, for instance. And then it's a matter of they are really interesting from a vegan seafood perspective, because they would have some nutritional benefits of seafood, but being a plant-based, not a meat-based option. But then there's also research on if we are able to actually extract the nutrients from the seaweeds, if we have the capacity to actually open up the cells. And I don't know what the research status is on that, but they are promising, I should say.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. I'm trying to multitask, and it usually goes bad.
Not easy.
So now I think this is maybe more for Wouter, but maybe for both. But Wouter can start. What's your advice for persons who live in countries where being a vegetarian is expensive and based on salary cannot be afforded? Meat is cheaper and lasts longer and can be paired with non-perishables for daily survival. It's certainly an upstream approach that would be needed, I imagine, but this may not be a priority for some countries. Any opinions here, Wouter?
I mean, it's an excellent question. That's my opinion, and it's also quite a difficult one to answer. And it does show that the dietary choices we make, they're very context dependent, right? And also when you're talking about reducing meat consumption, it's not the idea that everybody should reduce their meat consumption, right? So first of all, there's also the ones who already eat a lot of meat. So we're talking here about Western developed countries or parts of the world that would have to make the biggest changes, because that is where the most meat is being consumed at the moment. Also where, let's say, it is very difficult to shift to plant-based diet, and where it's about survival. Now, there's multiple issues there. So you do not want to threaten, someone's survival, but also about, I assume that will be in places where the impact overall will be smaller already, right? So it's, again, that relates to the first point that I was trying to make. So it's not as straightforward that really everybody now has to stop eating meat completely. Yeah, it is context dependent.
And this is also a theme that has been quite a lot debated by the recent, caused by the recent Seaspiracy documentary, where the message was basically that everyone should become vegans, and obviously not everyone can become vegans overnight, and maybe it will take a long time. And then there's also a question, should everyone? But that's another discussion. But we have to keep in mind that there are different opportunities in different countries. Okay, there are a lot of good questions, so I'm trying to pick some here and there. I think this is a bit interesting. I'm not sure if this is within your research agenda, Wouter, but in one group, they have been talking in the breakout room about the relationship between meat consumption and religion, and how meat consumption is not so much an issue in a country like India, where, well, you're not in general, based on religion, allowed to eat in meat, and how it can manage to balance the global issue such as meat consumption, which isn't necessarily the case in some places. So
and that's also a discussion we had in our breakout group actually. And so one of the greatest barriers to change is our social. Right, so meat is how we socialize. We eat with our family, we eat with our friends, and if it's part of that, let's say that the culture or the social norms, it's very difficult to change. And even if you would want to as an individual. So as I mentioned before, so one of my PhD students did research in this area, and also as part of her PhD, she conducted interviews. And many of the participants said, look, I'm vegetarian for 20 years, but when I go back to my parents, they still feed me a steak, right? So, and it's very difficult to say no then, because, they're your family, they're your friends, and you don't want to upset other people. So these are very important aspects. So it's not as simple as individuals just saying that, oh, I changed and then everything is hunky-dory. No, it is social, and that needs to be taken into account.
Like as an example, in the Norwegian children's birthday, it's always sausage. It's always hot dog. That's what you are supposed to eat on children's birthday. So it's like you're very early on put into this system.
Okay, we're trying to develop, sausages based on mussels and all other, because sausages are so, easy, it's a
Handy.
convenient format, but it's always based on meat. So you have the soy sausages that are really taking the world by surprise. But they don't even taste good. So
yeah, I don't know with the kids. I mean, they use half a liter ketchup with every sausage, so maybe they don't even taste whether it's made of, I don't know, mussels. Okay, there was a question I was thinking of asking from Sarah. So when you're engaging with seafood companies in regards to blue growth and applying system approach thinking, what kind of challenges have you faced?
Well, challenges, I'd say that from many seafood businesses are really happy to do carbon footprints because the land-based sector has really high carbon footprints. So most often they look good if you look at pelagic fish and so on. But of course, sometimes it could be problematic if you really want to do a carbon footprint of feed, and there's a lot of secrecy around recipes and sourcing, and but most often I think they are quite cooperative, the ones that my colleagues and I have been engaged with. And most often it has been really simple questions like we want a carbon footprint of this product that we believe in very much, and of course we can estimate that, but my question is always how we could what we can add on, and that's the point where we need more tools or more metrics or holistic assessments. But carbon footprints are quite straightforward.
Yeah. I have a question to Wouter, which is maybe a bit more general, but also related to the results you were showing. Someone is asking about measuring the meat consumption, because many of these kind of psychological studies that you are also doing are measuring intentions and how much is then sort of, people are very good at making promises. We all promise something every New Year's Eve and then it never happens. Oh, sometimes maybe, but mostly we are better at making promises than keeping them, at least when it comes to food and that kind of things. So what would you say about the measuring? What is the best way of?
Well, there's not a best way of measuring things. It's about, of course, the aims of the study, and also as part of the climate center, we're using different methodologies, which includes, quantitative and qualitative work and interventions as well. Now, as part of our national survey, so we're conducting a survey every year and to see whether there's any change in terms of, attitudes and behaviors. Now, we're almost restricted to asking intentions because of methodology. But then if you have intervention research, so the one that I showed by Emily Wolstenholme, there we use techniques like a daily food diary, so that people record every day how many portions they had of, red meat, processed meat, white meat, fish, plant-based proteins, replacement products and things like that. And they are quite reliable because it's you don't rely on general ideas or on recollection. It's just, okay, what did I eat today? And that is something that people then still know. There's still, measurement error in that, of course, but they're far more reliable than, for example, intentions.
Yeah. Well, I know when I keep food diary, I tend to eat much nicer because I don't want to write down that I ate a lot of chips and candy. But anyway, one thing that has also come up in this discussion is that, okay, when we talk about in general eating climate friendly, eating in a way that is good for our globe and sustainable and all that, is diversifying our diet important? Sarah was mentioning that on her part, like from the ocean we should eat more things than just shrimps and cod and salmon. But what do you say, whoever wants to go first? Sarah?
Yes, I definitely think we need to diversify and release pressure of some of the most precious seafoods. We work a lot with product development advice because we really need to understand the consumers in that sense of what are their interests, what are their fears. There is this seafood neophobia, like you're afraid of the new, that we're not used to eat algae in Sweden, but in Asia it's a longer tradition. How should algae be promoted and processed and displayed in Sweden. So it's really to know the market and the consumers, and while having this sustainability lens all the time. And that includes economy, because we talked about economy a lot in our breakout group, that seafoods can be quite not as affordable as many like really cheap meat-based options. So how to really allow for equity and this in terms of affordability seafoods.
Yeah. Wouter, any comments regarding this?
It's quite similar to what Sarah just mentioned. It is, moving away from, let's say, the standard 200 grams of steak, that you get in a restaurant or that you buy in the supermarket with another cheap cut of meat. So it is about, diversifying, but it's already happening. So if you're looking at new products that emerge in the supermarket, so many of them, I forget the numbers, but 1/3 of the new products, they're like meat replacements. Now, there was a question I saw in this thread. There's lots of questions, so I can't see them all about, what role can consumers play? It is about asking for those meat replacements. They're being launched because there is demand for these kind of products. And that also shows the interaction between demand and supply and production and retailers, right? So they're all part of the same coin. Yeah, and it is somewhere you need to break that cycle of, let's say, the demand and supply being all based on producing this other cheap bit of meat. And this is not to demonize, let's say, meat. For lots of people, meat is important. You should not, that is my opinion, take that away. But, there's also not a reason to eat, let's say, 0.5 kilogram of meat every day. And there is what those kind of meat replacements can help with, also in terms of them being part of, let's say, a normal potato, veg, and one piece of meat replacement, then, as it's known in Western Europe at least.
But may I add to that, because I eat mainly plant-based, and I also noticed this explosion of alternatives. But if you look at the nutritional value of most of those, it's a lot of salt, and it's a lot of they're highly processed. And wouldn't it be better to cut, the size of the steak sometimes, and really work with the other part of the plate, rather than it's so focused, especially in the Western world, the rich economies on the protein part of it. Yeah.
And that's a very good point. And it also shows, you need to think from a system perspective, what you already mentioned in your presentation. And also as part of a survey, we looked at people who would be willing to change, what they would do. Yeah, most people said, well, I just eat a little bit of, less meat. Only a few people said meat replacement, but a large proportion said, oh, I'm going to eat more fish. Now, if that's the case, then that will have consequences, what you were talking about. Right, so if you change one thing in one area, that will have consequences for a different area. So it's a very good point. Yeah.
We can't really add, so we need to replace. So we can't add pressures on the planet. So if we eat less meat, we could perhaps replace that with fish, but it's and perhaps produce more out of less. I don't know. Depends on the farming system.
Yes. So one thing that is also mentioned here, and I've also kind of been following a bit myself, my personal interest, is all this lab-based meat and lab-based fish, I guess, also already an issue. So basically that's the growing your meat and fish on a dish, Petri dish. Any opinions here, Wouter or Sarah? Both look like they are not very eager.
I have I don't know enough detail to give a informed opinion about that.
That's very professional answer, Wouter.
The same applies for me. I just heard of it, but I don't know much about it.
Yeah. And this how it is now. They're really, really expensive. Whatever, you can taste this, one. Yeah, but anyway, so we won't go into that direction because we don't have the the needed expertise. One question that very quick someone was asking. I think this is the kind of question people always feel like, well, I just need someone to tell me what to do. Like there was regarding eating fish to Sarah. Should you eat your fish fresh or frozen? Is there a rule of thumb?
To some extent, it's a very, very easy answer, because there is a lot of thoughts that if it's frozen, it's not the same quality. but that is not the case these days, because they have a lot of very good techniques for that. And if you freeze the product, then you can transport it more slow, and then you can avoid these air freights, and you can have a more sustainable, low carbon seafood product if you can eat it frozen. And the global supply chains of seafood are highly international. It goes all over. It's been processed and fished and produced in different areas of the world. So from that perspective, frozen seafood is the preferred one. Fresh, I guess, if you can go out and catch, if you have very, very local, then I guess, but not, you cannot eat a fresh salmon in China. Produced in Norway. So it's really about where you eat and where the production is and where the consumption is.
Yeah. I'll see what's one question here about the willingness of the consumer to pay, and not only willingness but also ability. So seafood, for example, in many countries is maybe, I don't know, more or less affordable food source. So how would you convince poor people to eat more fish to reduce associated carbon print is a question that is here.
For seafood, I'd say that we're part to blame there. I'd say that it's a highly valuable resource, and there is a lot of export value for low-income countries to export the seafood. And I guess that drives the prices or the availability for local populations that are really in need of this highly nutritional resource. So I think I mentioned that in the talk, that it's really about a better equity in terms of sharing a common resource and allowing for affordability, because it's really important for nutrition in many areas of the world. So it's not about convincing for carbon footprint perspectives, in my opinion. It's rather than allowing for people that want to eat fish to be able to eat it.
Well, I have actually one question myself, and it's mostly to Wouter, because you've been talking about meat consumption and what people think about reducing it as a climate mitigation. But isn't ethics, like, there are a lot of people who don't want to eat meat because they don't want to eat animals. Is that like, I remember that one of your crafts had kind of at least environmental, and then there was sort of, I can't remember exactly. Is that part of your, like, how are people's perception about pain or things like that?
Yeah. So first to comment on the last question, if I may.
Sure.
It's about changing the diet of poor people. I think we have to move away from that. It's not poor people who have to change; it's the affluent who have to change. If you're looking at carbon footprint, it's the ones in the West who emit by far the most, and that is where changes have to happen. And if you're talking about poor people, there's not. Carbon emissions are not that high that you would want to take healthy food away. So we need to get away from that idea.
Yeah, but I think if I could just comment, Wouter, here, I guess what Sara is saying, that if we kind of take the food, then it will become more expensive there, right? So
that's also part of it. Yeah.
And then there was someone who asked in the chat earlier about this relationship between people in developed and less developed countries, and I think what you are saying here, that we in Western countries with better economies, we have to do something. It's we who have the most highest responsibility and also the greatest possibility of doing something. Okay, but then the other question was about no, I already forgot. Maybe you remember.
It's about meat consumption. You don't only do it for environmental reasons. It's also for welfare reasons. And again, if I may refer to the research conducted by Emily Wolstenholme, she did research into that. And actually, you can see there's a journey into vegetarianism and veganism, and so that animal welfare, at least in the UK, is the first. Let's say, reason why people change their diet. So it's not the environment, it's not health, it is animal welfare. But then, they become more familiar with the topic, and they start reading about the topic, and they hear about climate change, and that actually reinforces people's choices to eat less meat. And you can also see there's a step, change that is often happening that people start to eat less meat, then they go into vegetarianism, and then a smaller group, but still a substantial one, stop eating meat and using meat products completely. So usually environment is not a primary, but it's a secondary reason for people to stop eating meat and continue stop eating meat.
Yeah, and I guess it can also be part of, you know, as you were saying, your parents will always give you a steak, no matter what, how long you will have not eaten meat. So maybe it's also part of what you can start convincing the people around you that it's not only because I don't, if you have welfare considerations, but then there are actually many other good reasons also to reduce. So maybe that kind of can used as an argumentation of this, even though your internal motives might be different from the beginning.
Yeah.
So, okay, let me see. Do you have any questions to each other while I'm trying to read the chat?
It's quite difficult to keep track of the question. I do have it here on the right hand side, but it's very difficult to see what is being asked.
I think this has been really a nice discussion. I mean, this is an easy theme in a way because everyone has to eat. So these are decisions that we all have to make each and every day. So I think this is hopefully been a session that everyone can have some take-home messages. Messages to
and tradition is really difficult to to step away from the tradition of what you eat.
Yeah. Okay, I think we are closing to coming towards the end of here. Any great summarizing thoughts from Wouter or Sara?
Well, there's a question, the last question, which is quite interesting. So we're very tied to our diet, and the answer to that, I think, is yes and no. Because we are, and it's very difficult to change, and they're mostly habitual and they're social. So we're getting socialized into, you know, certain kinds of diet, and also the other comments in terms of religion and what is available and things like that. And that's completely true. But it's not impossible to change our diets. And if you're looking at the changes that have been made over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, they're absolutely immense. Yeah, so they used to be based on potatoes in the Netherlands, but if you're looking at the variety of what we eat now, it's you know, multiple factors is greater. You know, pasta, we didn't eat pasta 50 years ago, but we do now almost, you know, every week. Yeah, so it is possible to change our diet. So we are tied to it, but that doesn't mean that it's not possible to change.
It is, but for seafood, sometimes some are easier to let go of and some are more difficult to let go of, because some are more highly valued than others, even though you know that they are more impactful. And I really tend to blame the management. You know, there should be no unsustainable food products on the market, because it shouldn't be left to the consumers to decide on, make all these tough decisions. There should not be any farming practices that destroys the local ecosystem in any way, if you or whatever. So it's really important for that perspective to really have the start of the value chain with a really sound production system, and then everything will solve in the end.
Yeah. Okay, thanks a lot, Wouter and Sara, and everyone who's been participating with questions and breakout rooms. I think we now have to let people go, because I think they have to enter the next session very soon. So thanks so much, guys. This was great. I really enjoyed the discussion and your presentations. See you soon again in one form or the other. Bye bye.